This lonely trapper thought he was a hero, but he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. He finds a woman literally dying in a blizzard, brings her back to his cabin, and saves her from freezing to death. But when the sun comes up, he looks out his window and his blood runs cold. Her entire clan has his tiny cabin completely surrounded. He didn't just save a life, he broke one of their most sacred rules, and it was about to cost him everything. For a man named Silas, the winter of 1848 was mostly about silence. Not the comfortable kind of silence you might find in a warm parlor on a Sunday afternoon. No, this was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest like a physical weight. The kind that made you question whether you'd spoken your last words weeks ago and simply forgotten the sound of your own voice. For months now, the only sounds in Silas's world were three: the howl of the wind whipping through the ancient pines, the crackle and pop of his fire as it consumed another precious log, and the frantic pounding of his own heart when a snow-heavy branch came crashing down in the dead of night, making him bolt upright with his rifle in hand before he even knew he'd reached for it. His cabin, tucked away in a nameless valley somewhere in the Colorado Rockies, had become his entire universe. A tiny bubble of warmth, carved out of a vast, frozen emptiness that stretched for miles in every direction. Out here, there were no neighbors, no towns, no church bells on Sunday morning, just nothing. Silas was a trapper by trade, though that word doesn't quite capture what he'd become. He was a man who'd traded the noise and chaos of people for the quiet brutality of the frontier. And make no mistake, it was brutal. Every single day was a test. Every sunrise was a challenge. Every sunset was a small victory. His days had fallen into a simple ritual of survival. The same pattern repeated over and over until time itself seemed to blur. At first light, when the world was still painted in shades of blue and purple, he'd pull on his heavy coat, strap on his snowshoes, and check his trap lines. His snowshoes would make the only marks on that fresh white blanket, the only evidence that a human being still existed in this frozen wasteland. He'd come back, maybe with a rabbit, maybe with a mink, sometimes with nothing at all. His beard would be caked in ice, little crystals forming on every hair. His fingers would be so numb he couldn't feel them anymore, just watched them move like they belonged to someone else. The rest of the day was for skinning whatever he'd caught, scraping the hides, mending his gear, and just staring into the fire. That fire, it was more than warmth, it was company. He'd watch those flames dance and flicker, and sometimes he'd talk to them, tell them about his day, about the rabbit that got away, about the dream he'd had the night before, and the fire would crackle back, and for a moment, just a moment, he could pretend he wasn't alone. But he was alone, deeply, profoundly, crushingly alone. The cabin itself told you everything you needed to know about Silas. He'd built it himself, every log, every beam, from timber he'd felled with his own axe. The gaps between the logs were chinked with mud and moss, packed in tight to keep the killing cold out. The roof was pine boughs layered thick, then covered with bark and snow. It was crude, rough, but it kept him alive. Inside, the cabin was barely 12 feet square. A stone fireplace took up one entire wall, built stone by stone from the creek bed. A simple cot sat against another wall, just rope and canvas stretched over a wooden frame. A small table, one chair, a few shelves holding his supplies, cornmeal, salt pork, coffee beans, a half-empty bottle of whiskey he was saving for. He didn't know what. Something special. Something worth celebrating. The single window wasn't glass. Glass was a luxury out here. It was stretched hide, scraped thin enough to let a little light through. On bright days it glowed amber. On dark days it was just another wall. At just 25 years old, Silas had the weathered, calloused hands of a man twice his age. His face was hard, carved by wind and sun and bitter cold into something that looked like it belonged to the mountains themselves. His eyes. They had that haunted look you see in men who've spent way too much time talking to themselves, who've spent too many nights lying awake, listening to the wind, wondering if tomorrow might be the day the supplies run out, or the day they simply forget why they're fighting to survive at all. The wilderness was a hard master. Maybe the hardest master a man could serve. It had stripped Silas down to his core, burned away everything soft, everything comfortable, everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Out here, you didn't have the luxury of being anything other than what you were. No masks, no pretending, just you and the mountain and the long, dark nights. He was starting to forget things, little things at first. The name of the town he'd left behind, the face of the girl who'd rejected him before he headed west, his mother's voice, then bigger things, the feeling of shaking another man's hand, the sound of laughter, real laughter, not the bitter bark he sometimes let out when something went wrong, the simple comfort of hearing another human voice say his name. Sometimes, in the depths of winter, when the sun barely made it above the horizon before sinking back down, Silas would wake up and not know if it was morning or evening. Time lost all meaning. One day bled into the next, into the next, into the next, until he could barely remember what month it was. But he kept going. That's what you did out here. You kept going. Because the alternative was lying down in the snow and letting the cold take you, and Silas wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The loneliness, though, that was harder than the cold, harder than the hunger, harder than the exhaustion that settled into his bones like frost. The loneliness was a living thing, a presence that filled every corner of the cabin, that sat across from him at the table, that whispered in his ear when he was trying to sleep. It made him do strange things. He'd set 2 tin cups out for coffee, even though he was the only one drinking. He'd save half his dinner on a plate, as if someone might come by to eat it. He'd practice conversations, playing both sides, asking questions, and answering them in different voices, until he realized what he was doing and felt a cold spike of fear that maybe he was losing his mind. The winter of 1848 was particularly cruel. The snow had started early, October, and hadn't let up. By November, the drifts were taller than a man. By December, Silas had stopped counting the days. What was the point? One frozen day was the same as the next. And then came January, the coldest month, the month when even the wolves went quiet, when the very air seemed to freeze solid, when your breath would crystallize before it left your lips. This was Silas's world. This was what he'd chosen, though on the darkest days he couldn't quite remember why. The freedom, maybe. The adventure. The chance to be his own man, beholden to no one. But freedom, he'd learned, was just another word for alone, and as the wind howled outside his cabin that January night, as he fed another log to his dying fire and pulled his blanket tight, Silas wondered, not for the first time, if he'd ever hear another human voice again. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours everything was about to change. The storms started the way they always did out here, innocent, deceptive. Just a few snowflakes dancing on the wind that afternoon, spinning and twirling like they were celebrating something. Silas barely noticed them as he hauled in wood for the night, stacking the logs by the door, each piece a promise of warmth against the coming darkness. But the mountain had other plans. By late afternoon, those innocent flakes had multiplied into something sinister. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue, was gone, completely erased, replaced by a churning wall of white that pressed down from above like the hand of an angry god. This wasn't just a snowstorm, this was a blizzard, the kind that old-timers talked about in hushed voices, the kind that buried entire wagon trains, the kind that made strong men weep with fear. The wind, Oh, the wind! It was like nothing Silas had ever heard. It shrieked, it howled, it screamed like 1,000 tortured souls. It clawed at the cabin walls, rattling the door on its leather hinges, shaking the whole structure until Silas wondered if his little sanctuary might simply blow apart, scattering him and his belongings across the white wasteland. He'd stoked his fire high, grateful, maybe for the first time, for these 4 walls he'd built with his own hands. Outside, the world was being erased. Landmarks he'd memorized, the lightning-struck pine, the boulder shaped like a bear's head, the frozen creek, all of it was vanishing under a suffocating blanket of white. This was the kind of blizzard that stole the breath right out of your lungs, that froze your eyes shut if you were foolish enough to face it, that killed with cold efficiency anyone caught out in it. Silas sat by his fire, listening to the storm's fury, feeling oddly safe. He had wood, he had food, he had shelter. Whatever that blizzard wanted to do out there, it couldn't touch him in here. Or so he thought. It was in the middle of all that chaos, when the wind was at its most violent, when the very walls seemed to groan with the strain, that he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. At first, he told himself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks. The mountain did that sometimes, made you hear things that weren't there, voices in the storm, footsteps on the roof, the crying of children in the darkness. But then he heard it again. A cry, faint and high and thin, almost swallowed by the storm the instant it was made. It was human. There was no mistaking it. Someone was out there, in the killing cold and the blinding white and the wind that could strip flesh from bone. Silas sat frozen, his rational mind battling with something deeper, something primal. The rational part said, "Stay inside. You'll die out there. Whatever made that sound is already dead or will be soon. You can't save them. You'll only kill yourself trying." But the deeper part, the part that still remembered what it meant to be human, wouldn't let him sit still. He rose slowly, moving toward the door like a man in a dream. His hands reached for his heavy coat, the one lined with rabbit fur. He wrapped his face in wool, covering everything but his eyes. He grabbed his rifle, though what good it would do against the storm, he couldn't say. Opening that door was like opening a gate to hell. The wind hit him with physical force, nearly knocking him back inside. Ice crystals stung his eyes like needles. The cold stabbed through his coat, through his shirt, through his skin, straight into his bones. He could barely see 10 feet ahead. Everything beyond that was just white chaos. Every instinct screamed at him to go back, to slam that door and return to his fire and forget what he'd heard. But he didn't. Throwing all reason aside, guided by something he didn't understand and couldn't name, Silas pushed forward into the blizzard. The wind tore at him, shrieking in his ears. Snow filled his boots. Ice formed on his eyebrows, his beard, his eyelashes. Each breath burned his lungs. He moved in the direction he thought he'd heard the cry, though in the chaos, direction meant nothing. He could have been walking in circles. He could have been walking away from his cabin, away from safety, toward a death as cold and white and empty as the void itself. And then he saw it. A shape, just a dark smudge against the blinding white. At first he thought it might be a fallen tree or a rock, or just his desperate mind creating patterns in the snow. But as he stumbled closer, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought they might break, he realized what he was seeing. It was a person, half buried in a snowdrift, so still that for a terrible moment Silas was sure he was looking at a corpse. He dropped to his knees beside the figure, his frozen hands reaching out, brushing away the snow. It was a woman. Her face was as pale as the snow she was lying in, so pale she looked almost blue. Her lips had lost all color. Her skin had that waxy quality that meant the cold was winning. Her eyes were closed, the lids dusted with frost. But it was her clothes that struck him. They weren't settler clothes, nothing like the simple wool and cotton he was used to seeing. These were hides, decorated hides, worked soft and supple and covered in intricate beadwork in patterns he'd never seen before, geometric designs, symbols, stories sewn into leather. Her dark hair was fanned out around her head like a frozen halo, long and black and tangled with ice. Apache, he thought, or maybe Ute, one of the mountain tribes, out here, alone in this. For one terrifying second, one heart-stopping moment, Silas thought he was too late, that he'd stumbled onto a frozen grave, that the cry he'd heard had been her last. But then, so faint he almost missed it. A tiny, shallow breath escaped her blue lips, a small cloud of vapor in the frozen air. She was alive. Barely, but alive. Silas didn't think. Didn't plan, didn't consider what this meant or what might happen next. He just acted. He slipped his arms under her, one beneath her shoulders, one beneath her knees, and lifted. She was lighter than he expected. Or maybe the fear gave him strength, but lifting her was only the beginning. The wind fought him for every step, trying to pull her back, trying to rip her from his arms. The snow was deep, up to his thighs in places, and every step forward was a battle. He couldn't see his cabin, couldn't see anything. He could only hope he was moving in the right direction, could only pray that his sense of the mountain hadn't abandoned him. He shielded her with his own body, bending over her, making himself a barrier between her and the storm. The cold bit into his back, his neck, his shoulders. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned. His legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But he kept going, one step, then another, each one a small victory against the mountain, against the storm, against death itself. And then, like a miracle, like a gift from a merciful God, the dark outline of his cabin appeared through the white chaos. He'd found it, found home. Silas burst through the door with his precious cargo, stumbled inside, and slammed it shut behind him with his boot. The sudden silence was deafening. After the shrieking fury of the storm, the cabin felt like a tomb, still and quiet and impossibly warm. He stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, his body shaking from exertion and cold and the shock of what he'd just done. Water dripped from his coat, his beard, his eyebrows, melting in the firelight. But there was no time to rest. The woman in his arms, she was dying. Silas laid her down as gently as he could on his cot by the fire, the only bed in the cabin, his own bed. His hands were shaking, whether from cold or fear or exhaustion, he couldn't say. Maybe all three. She looked even worse in the firelight. Her face wasn't just pale, it was grey, the colour of ash. Her lips were blue-purple, like a bruise. Her skin felt like ice when he touched it, cold and hard and wrong. He'd seen men freeze to death before, knew the signs, the way the cold crept in from the extremities, shutting down fingers and toes first, then hands and feet, then arms and legs, and finally, the core, the heart. Once it reached the heart, there was no coming back. She was close, dangerously close. Her clothes were stiff with ice, frozen solid in places, and Silas knew, with a cold certainty that made his stomach clench, that if he didn't get those clothes off her, if he didn't get her warm, the cold would finish what the blizzard had started. But this was complicated. She was a woman, a stranger, from a people he didn't know, whose customs he couldn't guess at, and he was about to undress her. His hands hesitated. His mind raced through the implications. But then he looked at her face, at those blue lips, at the shallow, laboured breathing, and he knew there was no choice. Modesty was a luxury neither of them could afford. With numb, fumbling fingers, moving as fast as his frozen hands would allow, he began to work. He unlaced her tunic, a beautiful thing made of deer hide, decorated with dyed porcupine quills in red and yellow and blue. He peeled it away from her skin, where it had frozen to her flesh in places. Her moccasins came next, tall ones that reached nearly to her knees, lined with rabbit fur, now hard as stone. He had to cut the laces. They wouldn't budge otherwise. He tried to be respectful, tried to look away, to give her dignity even though she was unconscious, even though she'd never know. But his focus was singular. Survival. Her survival. As he worked, as more of her was revealed, he noticed the details, the things that told him who she was, or at least where she came from. The intricate beadwork on her clothes wasn't random. It told a story. There were patterns he recognized from his time in the territories, symbols of protection, of strength, of connection to the land, and patterns he didn't recognize, private meanings from a culture he knew nothing about. On her left wrist, there was a tattoo, a small spiral, delicate and precise, like water swirling down a stream, or smoke rising from a fire. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Around her neck, half hidden beneath her hair, hung a small medicine bag, leather worn soft with age and handling, decorated with tiny shells and a single turquoise stone. Sacred items, personal items, the kind of things you didn't part with lightly. These weren't the markings of a settler. This was someone from a different world, a world that had been here long before men like Silas arrived with their traps and their cabins and their lonely ambitions, a world with its own people, its own rules, its own gods. Once her frozen clothes were removed, laid out by the fire to dry, Silas wrapped her in every blanket he owned. He had 3, rough wool things, scratchy but warm. He cocooned her in them, tucking them tight around her body. Then came the delicate work of warming her. He knew from hard experience that you couldn't warm someone too fast. It could kill them just as surely as the cold, shock the system, stop the heart. So he worked slowly, methodically. He heated water over the fire, not boiling, just warm, and soaked strips of cloth in it. He pressed these against her hands, her feet, her neck, the places where the cold had bitten deepest. He massaged her fingers gently, trying to coax the blood back into them. He managed to get a few sips of warm water between her blue lips, tilting her head carefully, supporting it with one hand while he trickled the water in drop by drop. Most of it dribbled out the sides of her mouth, but some went down, some reached her throat. It was something, it was hope. For hours, he sat by her side like this. The storm raged outside, a monster trying to get in, but inside the cabin, a fragile quiet had taken hold. The fire crackled. The woman breathed, shallow but steady, and Silas was no longer alone. The realization hit him with unexpected force. For the first time in months, maybe years, there was another living, breathing human being in his world. He could hear her breathe, could watch the rise and fall of her chest beneath the blankets, could see her eyelids flutter as she drifted through whatever dreams or darkness held her. It was both a comfort and a terror. A comfort because the loneliness, that crushing, suffocating loneliness, had lifted. Just for a moment, just for tonight. He wasn't talking to the fire anymore. He was sitting vigil over a life, a real life, but a terror because... What happened next? When she woke, if she woke, what then? They didn't speak the same language, came from different worlds. He'd pulled her from the snow, yes, but what right did that give him? What claim? What responsibility? And more troubling, why had she been out there alone? The tribes didn't send their women out into winter storms without reason. The Apache, if that's what she was, were survivors. Practical, smart. They knew the mountain better than any white man ever would. So why had she been out there, running from something, running to something, lost, abandoned? Or, and this thought made his stomach turn, had she been out there on purpose? Some tribes had rituals, tests, ways of proving yourself to the spirits or to your people. He'd heard stories, whispered around campfires, told by other trappers and traders, vision quests, trials, young people sent into the wilderness alone to find their path. If that was true, if she'd been out there as part of some sacred trial, then what had he done by bringing her in, by saving her? Had he helped her, or had he interfered with something he didn't understand? The questions gnawed at him as he sat there in the firelight watching her sleep. He added another log to the fire, checked her pulse, still weak, but there, adjusted the blankets, waited. The storm began to die down as morning approached. The howling wind faded to a moan, then to a whisper, then to nothing. The world outside grew quiet, that special kind of quiet that only comes after a blizzard, when the snow has muffled everything and even sound seems frozen. And that's when her eyes opened. Silas saw it happen, saw the moment consciousness returned. Her eyes, dark, almost black in the firelight, fluttered open slowly, like a bird testing its wings. For a second, they were unfocused, confused, seeing without understanding. And then they focused, landed on him, on his face, on this strange bearded man in this strange place. And what he saw in those eyes made his breath catch. Fear, pure, animal fear. She tried to push herself away with a weak, startled cry, a sound that was more instinct than anything, but her body wouldn't obey. She was too weak, too drained. Her arms trembled with the effort and gave out. Silas immediately held up his hands. Palms open, fingers spread, the universal gesture of peace. He backed away slowly, giving her space, making himself as non-threatening as possible. He spoke to her in a low, calm voice, the kind of voice you'd use to gentle a frightened horse. Easy, easy now, you're safe. I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe here. He knew she couldn't understand the words, but maybe she could understand the tone, the intention behind it. He pointed to the fire, to the warmth, then to the blankets wrapped around her, then to the small wooden bowl on the floor. Empty now, but it had held broth earlier. He was trying to show her, I gave you these things, I helped you, I'm not a threat. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the terror in her eyes began to fade, not disappearing completely. She was still wary, still frightened, but giving way to something else. Confusion, maybe. Uncertainty. She looked around the cabin with those sharp, intelligent eyes, taking in every detail, the rough walls, the simple furnishings, the pelts hanging from hooks, the rifle leaning in the corner, his coat still dripping by the door. She was reading the space, reading him, trying to understand where she was and how she'd gotten here. Her hand moved, slowly, carefully, to touch the blankets around her, then to her own skin. She seemed to realize, all at once, that her clothes were gone, that she was nearly naked beneath these strange wool blankets. Her eyes snapped back to Silas, and he saw a flash of something, anger maybe, or shame, but he quickly shook his head and pointed to her clothes, laid out by the fire, steaming as they dried. They were frozen, he said, even though she couldn't understand. You would have died. I had to. He trailed off, then just gestured helplessly at the clothes, at her, at himself. The anger in her eyes softened. She seemed to understand, or at least to accept. Her gaze drifted to the fire, and she stared into it for a long moment, as if reading her own story in the flames. Silas moved slowly, carefully, to the small pot hanging over the fire. He'd made broth earlier, just water and salt and some dried meat, and it was still warm. He ladled some into the wooden bowl and carried it to her, taking small, deliberate steps, showing her he meant no harm. He held out the bowl, waited. After a long moment's hesitation, after studying his face one more time, She reached out and took it. Her hands were trembling, whether from weakness or residual cold or fear, he couldn't tell. But she brought the bowl to her lips and sipped again, and then drank deeply, the warm liquid bringing color back to her cheeks. They sat there in silence as the first real light of dawn crept through the cracks in the walls and around the edges of the hide-covered window. Pink and gold and soft, a new day, a day she almost hadn't seen. A silent connection had been made in the heart of that storm. Two people from different worlds, thrown together by chance and by choice. He'd saved her life. She knew it. He knew it. What neither of them knew, what neither of them could possibly imagine, was that this simple act of mercy was about to be judged. And the judges were already coming. Dawn broke clean and blindingly bright over the mountain. The blizzard was gone, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, the kind of blue that hurts to look at, pure and cold and infinite. The world had been transformed overnight into something that looked like it belonged in a dream. Fresh snow covered everything. The drifts were taller than a man in places, sculpted by the wind into smooth, flowing curves that looked almost artistic. The trees sagged under the weight of white. The entire landscape sparkled in the early sunlight like it had been dusted with diamonds. It was beautiful, painfully, impossibly beautiful. Silas moved to the small window, rubbing the condensation off the stretched hide to look outside. He felt a strange wave of relief washing over him. They'd survived, both of them. The woman was weak, still wrapped in blankets by the fire, still pale, but her color was coming back. Her breathing had strengthened. She was going to make it. He actually smiled. A real smile. The first in, he couldn't remember how long. And then he saw them. At first it was just one figure, a dark silhouette at the edge of the clearing, standing perfectly still against all that white. So still it might have been a tree trunk, or a trick of the light, or something his tired mind had conjured up. But then the figure moved, and another appeared beside it, and another, and another. Silas felt his breath catch in his throat, felt his heart start to hammer against his ribs, felt a cold that had nothing to do with winter creeping up his spine. Within minutes, his cabin was surrounded. They emerged from the tree line like ghosts, like spirits manifested from the snow itself. Tall, imposing figures wrapped in furs and hides. Some wore blankets over their shoulders, not the rough wool blankets of settlers, but beautifully woven ones with intricate patterns. Others wore only their decorated leather tunics, despite the cold, as if they were above such concerns as freezing temperatures. Their faces were stern, unreadable, hard as the granite cliffs that towered over the valley. Some held bows, long, powerful bows made from wood and sinew. Others carried spears, not crude shafts of wood, but finely crafted weapons with obsidian points that glittered in the sunlight. A few had rifles, old trade guns, but rifles nonetheless. They didn't make a sound, didn't call out, didn't speak or shout or threaten. They just watched. Silas felt his mouth go dry. His hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, leaning in the corner where he'd left it. But even as his fingers closed around the cold metal, he knew how useless it was. One rifle, one shot. Against how many? 20? 30? He'd be dead before he could reload. Behind him, he heard a sharp intake of breath. The woman had seen them too. He turned to look at her, and what he saw on her face made his stomach drop. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy at being rescued. It was resignation, deep, heavy, sorrowful resignation. The look of someone who knows exactly what's about to happen, and knows there's nothing that can be done to stop it. "Who are they?" Silas asked, even though he knew she couldn't understand, even though it was a foolish question. He could see who they were, her people, her clan come looking for her. But the real question, the one that made his blood run cold, was, what did they want? The answer came quickly. The cabin door didn't open. It was pushed open, with force, the leather hinges creaking in protest. Silas hadn't barred it, hadn't even thought to bar it. Why would he? There was no one out here, no one for 100 miles. Or so he'd believed. In the doorway stood a man older than the rest. His face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of sun and wind and cold. His hair was long and streaked with grey, held back by a leather band. He wore a magnificent buffalo robe over his shoulders, and around his neck hung multiple strands of shell beads and turquoise. This was a man of authority, a leader, a chief. His eyes swept the cabin in a single, comprehensive glance. Took in the simple furnishings, the drying pelts, the rifle in Silas's hand, and then those eyes found the woman on the cot. A flicker of something crossed the old man's face, relief maybe, or gratitude. For just an instant, Silas saw human emotion in that stern mask, but then it was gone, replaced by something harder, colder, and that gaze, sharp as an obsidian blade, landed on Silas. The silence that followed was a physical weight. It pressed down on the cabin, made it hard to breathe. Silas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could feel sweat forming on his palms despite the cold. The leader stepped into the room. His presence seemed to shrink the small space, to make the walls press closer, the ceiling lower. Other men filed in behind him, 4, 5, 6 of them, filling the cabin until Silas felt crushed by their numbers. The woman tried to speak. Her voice was soft, weak, but urgent. She said something in her language, a flowing, guttural tongue that Silas couldn't begin to understand. But whatever she said, the leader wasn't interested. He raised one hand, a single sharp gesture, and she fell silent. The message was clear. He wasn't here to listen to her. The leader spoke. His voice was deep and rough like stones grinding together. The words meant nothing to Silas. Just sounds, harsh and foreign. But the tone was unmistakable. This was an accusation. Another man stepped forward. Younger than the leader, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't twisted with anger. He looked at Silas, then at the woman, then back to Silas. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear, and what he said made Silas's blood turn to ice. She was on her solitude trial, the translator said, each word falling like a hammer blow. For 3 days, she was to face the winter spirits, alone. No food, no fire, no shelter. It is the way she proves her strength to our people, the way she earns her place as a woman of the clan. He paused, letting the words sink in like poison. You found her, the translator continued, his voice dropping lower, colder. You brought her into your lodge. You touched her. You removed her sacred clothes. You gave her warmth, comfort, shelter. The man's eyes narrowed, and when he spoke again, his voice was laced with a fury that made the air itself feel dangerous. You have broken the trial. You have stolen her journey. You have interfered with the Spirit's test. In the eyes of our people, in the eyes of the ancestors, she is now shamed. She has failed, and for that crime, a price must be paid. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Silas felt the world tilting beneath his feet. His act of mercy, his desperate attempt to save a dying woman from a blizzard, had just been twisted into a crime, a violation, a sin against laws he didn't know existed. He looked from the translator to the leader, whose face remained an unreadable mask, then to the other warriors crowding the cabin, their hands resting on weapons, and finally, to the woman herself. Her face was a mixture of fear and defiance. She sat up straighter despite her weakness, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her dark eyes blazed with something Silas couldn't quite name. She was dying, Silas heard himself say. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, steady even though his heart was racing, even though every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something other than stand there and speak calmly to men who might kill him. The storm would have killed her, he continued, meeting the translator's eyes. She would have frozen, would have been dead by morning. I did what any person would do, what any decent human being would do. The translator's lip curled. You are not our people, he shot back. You don't know our ways. You don't understand what you saw. You saw a body in the snow. We saw a spirit on a sacred path, a warrior facing her test, and you interfered. She's not a spirit, Silas said, his voice rising despite himself. She's a woman, a living, breathing woman who would have died if I'd left her out there. How is that sacred? How is that honorable? You question our ways? The translator took a step forward, and Silas saw hands tightening on weapons all around the room. You, a stranger, a trespasser on land that has belonged to our people since the world was young. You dare to judge our traditions. The leader spoke again, a single sharp word that cut through the tension like a blade. The translator stopped, stepped back, but his eyes never left Silas's face. And then the woman spoke. When the woman spoke, everything changed. She found a strength that shouldn't have been possible, not after what she'd been through, not after lying half dead in the snow, after coming so close to slipping into that final darkness from which there is no return. But she rose from the cot anyway, clutching the blanket around her shoulders like armor, and faced the leader of her clan, faced the man who held her fate, and Silas's fate, in his weathered hands. Her voice rang out clear and strong. The weakness was still there. You could hear it in the slight tremor, in the way she had to pause for breath. But the conviction, that was unmistakable. She spoke in her own language, in long, flowing sentences that rose and fell like music. Her hands moved as she talked, gesturing to the cabin, to the fire, to the dried clothes by the hearth, and then to Silas himself. Silas couldn't understand a single word, but he could feel it, could feel the power of what she was saying, the desperation, the gratitude, the fierce, unshakable certainty. She was defending him. She pointed to the window, to the world of white outside, and her voice rose. She made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass the entire blizzard, the entire terrible night. Then she pressed both hands to her chest over her heart and spoke words that sounded like a plea. The leader listened. His face remained impassive, but his eyes were watching, really watching, taking in every word, every gesture, every nuance of her argument. The other warriors shifted uncomfortably. A murmur ran through them, a ripple of conversation, debate, disagreement. Some faces showed anger. Others showed, was that doubt? Uncertainty? The translator's jaw was clenched tight. He clearly didn't like what she was saying, but he didn't interrupt, couldn't interrupt, not while the leader was listening. The woman's voice dropped lower now, softer, almost tender. She looked directly at Silas as she spoke, and even though he couldn't understand the words, he understood the meaning. He saw it in her eyes. Thank you. You saved me. Without you, I would be nothing but bones beneath the snow. When she finished, the silence that fell was profound. Every person in that cabin was holding their breath, waiting, the moment stretched out, seconds becoming minutes, until Silas thought he might go mad from the tension. The leader's gaze swept the room, touched each of his warriors in turn, read their faces the way a trapper reads tracks in snow. Then his eyes came to rest on Silas, and for the first time, he really looked at him, not as an enemy, not as a criminal, not even as a stranger. He looked at Silas the way you look at a puzzle, something to be understood, something to be figured out. His eyes traveled around the simple cabin, took in the neatly stacked firewood, each log split with care, arranged with precision. The few tools hanging on the wall, well-maintained, organized, the tools of a man who took pride in his work. The single cot where the woman had been lying, the small table with its single chair. The leader saw what Silas had tried so hard not to see himself: loneliness. Profound, crushing loneliness. This wasn't the home of a man living. It was the shelter of a man merely surviving. And then the leader's eyes came back to Silas's face, studied him, read him like the land itself. He didn't see a villain standing there, didn't see someone who'd set out to break sacred laws or dishonor their traditions. He saw a man, alone and completely out of his depth, a man who'd acted on instinct, on compassion, without any understanding of the consequences, a man who'd done what he thought was right, even if it was wrong, by laws he never knew existed. He saw the truth written in the way Silas stood his ground, not with arrogance, not with defiance, but with the simple, stubborn conviction that he'd done what needed doing. That when faced with a choice between a sacred trial and a human life, he'd chosen life, and maybe, just maybe, that meant something. The leader spoke. His voice was no longer harsh. It was measured, thoughtful. He spoke at length, pausing occasionally as if choosing his words with great care. When he finished, another murmur ran through the warriors. This one was different, less angry, more contemplative. Men exchanged glances, nodded slowly. A few still looked unhappy, but even they seemed to be considering. The translator turned back to Silas. When he spoke, the anger had drained from his voice, replaced by something harder to define. Respect, maybe, or at least acknowledgement. The chief says... He paused, seeming to struggle with how to translate not just words, but meaning. He says that you are ignorant. You know nothing of our ways, our laws, our spirits. You are like a child stumbling through a sacred ceremony, breaking everything you touch without meaning to. Silas opened his mouth to protest, but the translator held up a hand. But, the translator continued, a child who breaks something out of ignorance is not the same as a man who breaks something out of malice. You didn't know. You couldn't have known. And more than that, he glanced at the woman, then back to Silas. You acted from the heart, from what you call compassion, what we call the duty of one human to another. The translator took a breath. The trial was broken, that cannot be undone. She will bear the mark of this failure for the rest of her life. But she is alive to bear it, and that is not nothing. A life was saved, the translator said, and now his voice carried the weight of official pronouncement. That cannot be ignored. The trial was broken, yes, but death was cheated. A debt was created between her and you, between our people and you, and according to our law, that debt must be paid. Silas felt his muscles tense. Here it comes, he thought, the price, the punishment. But what happened next? He never could have predicted. One of the warriors stepped forward. He was younger than the others, maybe Silas's own age, with a face marked by 3 parallel scars across his left cheek. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator. He knelt down and unwrapped a bundle he'd been carrying. The hide fell away to reveal a pelt. But not just any pelt. This was a beaver skin, but unlike any beaver Silas had ever trapped. It was enormous, thick, so dark it was almost black, the kind of pelt that would fetch a fortune back east, the kind trappers dreamed about but rarely found. The warrior laid it on the floor in front of Silas with careful reverence. Then he stepped back. Another warrior came forward. This one carried something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal strips of meat, dried, smoked, prepared with care. Enough to feed a man for a month, maybe more. He placed it beside the pelt. A third warrior added a small pouch. When it landed, Silas heard the soft clink of something inside. Beads, maybe, or shells, things of value. The leader spoke again, just a few words this time. The translator turned to Silas. "These gifts are not charity," he said carefully. "They are payment, balance. You offered shelter when you had little, food when you had less, warmth from your own fire. These things have value, and value must be answered with value. This is our way," the translator continued. "When a debt is created, it must be settled. Otherwise, it weighs on the spirit, becomes a chain binding both parties. You saved her life. That is a debt that cannot truly be repaid. A life is worth more than all the beaver pelts in these mountains, but it can be acknowledged. It can be honored." Silas stared at the gifts on the floor. His mind was reeling, trying to process what was happening. They weren't here to punish him. They were here to pay him. "I don't—" he started, then stopped. "I don't want payment. I did what anyone—" "Take them," the translator interrupted, but his voice wasn't harsh. "To refuse would be to dishonor the gift, to dishonor her. Do you understand? This is how we maintain balance. This is how we keep the world in order." Silas looked at the woman. She was watching him intently, and when their eyes met, she gave a small nod. "Please," that nod said, "accept this. For me." Slowly, feeling like he was moving through a dream, Silas bent down and picked up the beaver pelt. It was heavy in his hands, real, solid, worth more than everything he owned combined. And his voice caught, "Thank you." The translator didn't translate that, didn't need to. The meaning was clear enough. The leader gestured to the woman. It was time. Time for her to leave this strange cabin and return to her people, to face whatever consequences awaited her there. She moved toward the door, but stopped at the threshold, turned back. For a long moment she just looked at Silas, really looked at him, and in that look, in those dark, intelligent eyes, Silas saw everything that couldn't be said with words. He saw gratitude, deep and genuine and absolute. She knew, they both knew, that without his intervention she would be dead, frozen solid in a snowdrift, just another victim of the mountain's cruel indifference. He saw sorrow for the trouble she'd brought him, for the fear he must have felt when an entire clan surrounded his cabin, for the price he'd nearly paid for his kindness. He saw respect for a man who'd risked his own life, who'd walked into a killing blizzard to save a stranger, a man who'd acted with honor even when he didn't understand the consequences. And he saw goodbye, final and absolute. This was not "see you later" or "until next time." This was the end. A door closing, a bridge burning. They'd shared one night, one desperate, impossible night, and that was all they would ever share. Their worlds had touched, for just a moment, and now they were separating again, like two streams that briefly merged before flowing in different directions. She raised one hand, just slightly, just a small gesture, and Silas found himself doing the same, a farewell between two people who'd probably never see each other again. Then she turned and walked out into the brilliant white morning, and her people closed around her like a protective wall. And then they were gone. Just like that. As silently as they'd come, they vanished back into the trees, back into the wilderness, back into their world, which was so close to his and yet so impossibly far away. Silas stood in the doorway of his cabin and watched them go. Watched until the last figure disappeared into the tree line. Watched until there was nothing left but footprints in the snow, and even those would be gone by the next snowfall. The silence that followed their departure was crushing. Silas stood there in the doorway for a long time, just stood there, staring at the empty clearing, at the disturbed snow where dozens of feet had stood, at the path they'd taken back into the forest. The cold bit at him. He hadn't put his coat back on, but he barely felt it. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere between the terror of thinking he might die and the strange, hollow feeling of realizing he was going to live after all. Finally, When his fingers started going numb and his teeth began to chatter, he stepped back inside and closed the door. The cabin felt different now, smaller somehow, emptier, which was strange because it was exactly the same as it had always been. Same walls, same fireplace, same cot, same table, same chair. But it had been changed by what happened, marked, the way a room is marked when something important occurs in it, birth or death or revelation. The space itself remembers. Silas looked down at the gifts, still lying where he'd placed them. The magnificent beaver pelt, the strips of smoked meat, the small pouch that clinked softly when he picked it up and found it full of polished shells and turquoise beads. Payment, the translator had called it, balance for a debt. But Silas didn't feel balanced. He felt confused, shaken, like the ground beneath his feet had shifted and he was still trying to find his footing. He'd saved a life. That was supposed to be simple, good, right, black and white, but nothing about what just happened had been simple. He'd saved her, but he'd also shamed her. He'd acted with compassion, but he'd broken something sacred. He'd done the right thing, but it had been the wrong thing. How could both be true at once? Silas moved to the fire and sank down into his chair, the only chair worn smooth by months of use. He held his hands out to the flames, but the warmth couldn't reach the cold place that had opened up inside him. For months, his life had been simple. Wake up, check the traps, come home, survive, repeat, day after day after day. No complications, no choices, no consequences beyond his own survival. But in one night, in a few desperate hours, everything had changed. He'd been seen, really seen, not just by the woman, though that was part of it, but by her entire clan, by the leader whose wise eyes had looked into Silas's soul and read him like a book, by the warriors who'd stood in his cabin and witnessed his poverty, his loneliness, his bare survival. They'd seen him, and they'd judged him, and somehow he'd been found. What, guilty, innocent, both? Silas picked up the beaver pelt and ran his fingers through the thick, dark fur. This alone was worth more than anything he owned, worth more than his cabin, probably. He could take this to the nearest trading post, 3 weeks' travel when the snow melted, and trade it for a year's worth of supplies, maybe more. But somehow it felt heavy, like it weighed more than just its physical substance, like it carried the weight of obligation with it. They'd paid him, honored him, but they'd also, forgiven him, dismissed him, accepted him? He didn't know, couldn't know. Their world was too different from his. Their laws, their customs, their way of seeing the universe, it was all foreign to him, like trying to read a book in a language he'd never learned. The loneliness came rushing back then, but it was different now. Before, it had been the loneliness of solitude, the simple absence of other people. Now, it was the loneliness of separation, of having touched another world and been pushed back, of knowing there were people out there, close enough to reach his cabin in a morning's walk, but impossibly far away in every way that mattered. He stood up and moved to the window, rubbed the hide until he could see through it. The sun was higher now, painting everything in shades of white and gold. Beautiful, deadly, indifferent. What was her name? He said aloud, his voice rough from disuse and emotion. I never even learned her name. That seemed important suddenly, critical. He'd held her while she was dying, peeled frozen clothes from her skin, watched her breathe through the night, defended her to her own people, and he didn't know her name. She was just the woman in the snow, the stranger, the catalyst that had turned his simple life inside out. Would she remember him, he wondered? Would she tell the story to her children someday about the strange white man in the lonely cabin who'd pulled her from death's grip? Or would this night fade from her memory, become just a blur of cold and fear and confusion? Would he be forgotten? The thought bothered him more than it should have. Silas turned away from the window and looked at his cabin with fresh eyes, really looked at it. saw what that leader had seen, what all of them had seen. One chair, one cot, one set of everything, a life built for solitude, for isolation, for a man who'd decided or had convinced himself that he was better off alone. But was he? Before last night, he would have said yes, would have defended his choice to leave civilization behind, to strike out into the wilderness, to make his own way without answering to anyone. That was freedom, wasn't it? But now he wasn't so sure. Freedom, or just hiding? The question sat in his chest like a stone. He spent the rest of that day in a strange, restless state. Couldn't settle, couldn't focus. He tried to do his normal routine, mending a trap that had sprung, sorting through his meager supplies, planning the next week's trapline. But his mind kept drifting. Back to the sound of her breathing in the darkness, the weight of her in his arms as he carried her through the blizzard, the way her eyes had looked when she first woke up, frightened, yes, but also alive, so impossibly alive. Back to the moment when that door had opened and he'd thought, this is it, this is how I die. Back to the leader's eyes, seeing right through him, seeing all the loneliness and desperation and fear he'd tried so hard to hide. As night fell and he lit his fire again, the same fire that had saved her life, Silas found himself talking aloud. Not to himself exactly, to her, to the memory of her, to the space where she'd been. "Did I do the right thing?" he asked the empty cabin. "I know I broke your trial. I know I interfered with something sacred, but you would have died. How could I have just walked past? How could I have just left you there?" The fire crackled. No answer came. He hadn't expected one. "I hope." He paused, struggling with the words. "I hope they don't punish you. I hope you're okay." That night, Silas lay in his cot, the same cot where she'd lain, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind was too full, too churning with questions and doubts and strange, unfamiliar feelings. He thought about the translator's words. A debt was created. But who owed whom? She'd said she owed him for saving her life, but didn't he owe her something too? She'd defended him, stood up to her own people, maybe even saved his life in return. Wasn't that a debt? Didn't balance require balance? The mathematics of obligation were making his head hurt. Finally, somewhere deep in the night, exhaustion claimed him. He drifted into uneasy sleep, and his dreams were full of snow and dark eyes and voices speaking in languages he couldn't understand. The days that followed were strange. Silas went back to his routine. Had to. Winter didn't care about his emotional turmoil. The traps still needed checking. The wood still needed chopping. Life still needed living. But it was different now. Everything was different. When he walked his trapline, he found himself watching the tree line, wondering if he was being observed, if her people were out there keeping an eye on him, making sure he didn't cause any more trouble. When he sat by his fire at night, he was hyper-aware of every sound outside, every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind. Was that just the mountain, or was it something else? He found himself talking more, speaking aloud to break the silence. Telling stories to whom he didn't know, maybe to himself, maybe to the ghosts of the people who'd filled his cabin for that brief, terrifying morning, maybe to her. The beaver pelt hung on his wall now, a constant reminder. Sometimes he'd touch it as he passed, running his fingers through that impossibly thick fur, and wonder what it meant. Was it a gift, a payment, a warning? Stay away, it might mean. You've done enough. Keep to your world and we'll keep to ours. Or maybe it meant, we see you, we know you're here, and you're not our enemy. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept him up at night, maybe it meant, we're even now, the debt is paid. Don't expect anything more, don't hope for anything more, this is all you get. One afternoon, maybe a week after that night, Silas was splitting wood when he found himself stopping mid-swing. The axe hung in the air, frozen, as a realization hit him. He wasn't lonely anymore. Oh, he was alone. Still very much alone. Nothing had changed about his physical circumstances, but the loneliness, that crushing, suffocating emptiness, it was different, lighter, like a weight had shifted. Because now he knew that he wasn't the only person in this vast wilderness, that there were others out there, living their lives, following their own paths, connected to him now by the thinnest thread of shared experience. He touched another world, and it had touched him back. And somehow, that was enough. Not everything he wanted, maybe. Not everything he needed, but enough. Enough to keep going, enough to keep surviving, enough to face another winter, another spring, another year of solitude. Because it wasn't solitude anymore, not really. He was alone, but he wasn't forgotten. That night, as Silas sat by his fire and stared into the flames, he raised his tin cup, filled with melted snow and a splash of his precious whiskey, in a silent toast. To her, wherever she was, whatever her name was, whatever her life looked like now. To the brief moment when two worlds had collided, when a lonely man had saved a dying woman, when mercy had been given and debts had been created and judgment had been passed. To the night that had changed everything, even though everything looked the same. "I hope you're well," he said quietly to the fire, to the darkness, to the great unknown. "I hope you're safe, and I hope you don't regret it. What happened? What I did." The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks spiraling up toward the darkness. And in that moment, in the warm glow of the flames, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Not happiness exactly, not contentment, but acceptance of his choices, of his life, of the strange path that had led him to this tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere. He'd saved a life. He'd broken a sacred trial. He'd been judged and been found complicated, neither innocent nor guilty, but something in between, human. And maybe that was enough. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow began to fall again, soft, gentle flakes that drifted down like feathers. The mountain was settling in for another long night, another season of cold and darkness and survival. But inside the cabin, Silas sat warm by his fire. The beaver pelt hung on his wall. The smoked meat filled his larder. The beads and shells sat in a small wooden box on his shelf, treasures from another world. He was still alone. Would probably always be alone, out here in the wilderness. But the silence didn't feel so empty anymore. It was filled now, filled with the echo of voices, the memory of faces, the knowledge that somewhere out there, under the same stars, the same moon, the same snow, someone else was remembering that night too. Someone else was carrying the weight of what happened, the debt, the judgment, the strange, impossible connection. And somehow, that made all the difference. Silas finished his whiskey, added another log to the fire, pulled his blanket tight around his shoulders. Tomorrow he'd wake up and check his traps. He'd hunt. He'd survive. He'd do what he'd always done. But tonight he'd sleep a little easier. Dream a little softer, rest a little deeper. Because he wasn't just a lonely trapper anymore. He was a man who'd done something that mattered, who'd made a choice that changed lives, his own and someone else's. He was a man who'd been seen, really seen, and judged and found human. And that was enough. The fire burned low, the snow fell soft. And in a tiny cabin in the vast frozen wilderness, a man named Silas closed his eyes and drifted into sleep. The mountain kept its secrets, the winter held its breath, and somewhere out there, in another cabin, another camp, another world, A woman with dark eyes and a tattoo of a spiral on her wrist closed her own eyes and remembered. Remembered the storm, the snow, the frozen moment between life and death. And remembered the stranger who'd chosen life. Whatever happened next, whatever came after, they'd carry this night with them. This impossible, complicated, sacred night, when everything changed and nothing changed, and the world got just a little bit smaller, just a little bit more connected. And in the great indifferent wilderness, that was its own kind of miracle. And that's how the mountain kept its secret. But tell me, if you were Silas, would you have walked into that blizzard? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And while you're here, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and check out these other stories waiting just for you. This is Dust and Honor Tales, where every story leaves a mark.